We'll use the raise your hand feature, but if we go ahead to the next slide here, we are asking you to, for public attendees, to hold your comments till the end. We have a public comment time that you'll see at the when we get to the agenda, and you can feel free to add questions as we go. So again, welcome. Today is going to be our second meeting talking about the, wait a minute, let me introduce myself. I was like, let me just jump right in and start talking. I'm Suzanne Carlson. I'm the Climate Office Director, and we head up the Transportation Electrification part of ODOT, and focused heavily on expanding charging infrastructure and supporting people in the transition to electrification, cleaner vehicles, and reducing our impact in climate change. So we've got a great group with us here today. We are going to talk today, is our second meeting, talking about the zero emission vehicle charging infrastructure deployment strategy and tools. We'll get into this plan a little bit. We are saving time at the end for public comment, and then we'll hear updates and next steps. Next slide. So welcome to our advisory group members. You can see them here. We also have Amanda Peets joining us. She's our Policy Data and Analysis Division Director. She'll speak a little later. And then we have a great group of stakeholders from utilities, cities, counties, vehicle manufacturers, climate activists, climate organizations, nonprofits, co-ops, and so forth. So it's been a really great group. We value your feedback. We've got a lot of great feedback and a lot to share today as well to get this report over the finish line. Next slide. And also great thanks to our project team, our hardworking project team, Mary Brazel and Jillian DeMedio from our climate office, Matt Noble with our communications, Jessica Reichers is here with Department of Energy, and then our great group with Kittleson and RMI, who have been our consultants through this and really have just brought us some great products that are making Oregon a leader in the industry with transportation electrification. Next slide. Today, we're going to focus in, I mentioned, on the deployment strategy objectives. We'll talk a bit about the purpose of the report. We're providing some tools and resources and best practices to help guide others in the charging infrastructure for electrification. Primarily, these tools are for local agencies and government leaders, as well as utilities and community-based organizations. And some of the tools are sort of in pilot phase already with folks using them. And we'll be launching the report and some of the tools in first quarter of 2023. We'll also have our electric micromobility report out in early 2023. So today we're really going to focus, like I said, on getting this over the finish line and getting feedback and sharing a lot of information around, as you see on the slide here, the best practices, planning level cost estimates and some shareable tools that we'll have there, planning and deployment approach, and then our near-term priorities and shared responsibilities. And with that, I'm going to hand the reins over to Ben Shapiro with RMI, who's going to dive into the meat of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. As she's just mentioned, my name is Ben Shapiro. I am a manager on RMI's carbon-free mobility team. I've spoken with many of you in the past, but for those of you who I haven't met, thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about what we are putting together for this ZEV deployment strategy. Next slide, please. So I want to start by focusing on some of the best practice areas that we're trying to highlight in this strategy. We've centered this around 3 different focal areas, the first being local planning and permitting, the second, business models and site design, and the third, utility engagement. As you can tell from these 3 categories, what we're trying to do is really address common knowledge gaps across a number of the primary areas that people trying to deploy EVSE often struggle with. What we're trying to do with this strategy is to make it a useful guide for a number of different audiences, as Suzanne has just articulated, but really with a focus on how can this get done at the local level? What are the tools, the resources, the knowledge that needs to be centered in one place for deployment in Oregon to really move forward and to enable the attainment of state goals? Next slide, please. On that local planning and permitting side, I should mention, we're going to be touching on sort of an overview of the deployment strategy and some of the main content today. There's quite a lot more detail in the draft strategy that we're putting together. And so if you don't see something in here certainly happy to discuss that towards the end, but we have a lot more going on in the report itself. So just to preview some of the types of local planning and permitting best practices that we're putting forth here, one of them at a high level is including EVSE. Oh, if you don't mind muting yourself if you're in the background, that would be helpful. Thank you. But one important policy or planning initiative here at the local level is to start including EVSE in local plans that already exist, such as general plans, climate action plans, and the like. This is a really fundamental step in terms of starting to treat this infrastructure that is relatively new for most of us as a part of the built environment, the same way that we do other infrastructure assets. An extension of that could be to develop an EV readiness plan that's really trying to articulate where are we today and where do we need to go relative to EV adoption and providing enough energy through charging stations for those vehicles. Related to that, there is certainly opportunity for setting goals for the amount of public charging within a community, whether that's a city, a county, some other authority having jurisdiction, and so forth. I don't want to just bore you by reading through all of these, so maybe I'll skip ahead a little bit, but the point here being there are a number of different best practices that we're consolidating and trying to make a centralized resource for local planners and other stakeholders to be able to use. Let's go to the next slide, please. Another category of best practices, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, is around business models and site design. Now, as many on the call are familiar with, there's no one way to structure the deployment of EV charging. And by that, I mean there are a number of different business models that EV charging is being offered through, whether that's a direct ownership approach where a site host is buying the charging infrastructure and then operating it without the involvement of third parties. And then sort of the other side of the coin there being various types of third-party ownership and operation. Now, I want to clarify that in this deployment strategy, we are not trying to say that one approach is better or worse, nor are we trying to say that one approach is always appropriate for a particular site type. You know, maybe that is a grocery store or an apartment building, a public DC fast charging site. Across any of these, there are different approaches to doing this. And what we're really trying to do with this strategy is to articulate what some of the key considerations to think through are for those at the local level trying to plan for this and trying to deploy charging stations. And with that, of course, the discussion sort of centers around what are some of the benefits and drawbacks of different approaches that site hosts and other stakeholders might want to think through as they're planning for this. On the right side of this slide, you can just see a sort of simple table that we adapted from the US Department of Transportation that we're trying to articulate the point here across these different roles that have to be involved in EV charging deployment. It's not always the same entity that is playing that role. And so in the vein of providing information for interested stakeholders, we're really trying to lay out how to think about this space. There's a lot of complexity, a number of different parties that can be doing different things, and trying to provide information around if you're coming into this and need some of those answers, how might you think about some of the key dynamics? Next slide, please. The other part of this section in the deployment strategy is around site design considerations. So those familiar with EVSE deployment will be very familiar. There are quite a few different considerations in thinking about how you select and also design a given site for putting in one or multiple EV charging stations. I won't go through this entire list, but you can get a sense of the sorts of topics that we are describing in this report. For example, how large the deployment needs to be based on what you expect the charging levels to be. What do you think that might look like in 5 years and not just today? Some future proofing of the assets that you're going to be putting in place so that you don't do a big project to put in place 2 level 2 chargers only to find in 2 years that you maybe need 6 and you didn't do the electrical capacity upgrades needed for that. Questions like that. Physical design characteristics. Networking, I think this is an important one. Question around whether or not there is a need for network chargers. For those who are not familiar, this is a generally more expensive type of charger, but that also provides a lot of additional benefits, being internet connected and being able to provide more information to owners and operators, as well as being easier to find for potential drivers and so forth. So no one-size-fits-all approach there, but an important discussion in the report around when that might be beneficial. And then signage and accessibility, another couple of important topics around making sure that these EV charging stations are able to be found, that we develop some consistent signage so that there's sort of brand recognition across Oregon, at least at the local level and ideally across Oregon, and that accessibility to make sure these sites are designed with multiple types of drivers in mind. Next slide, please. And then lastly here, I want to touch on the third category of our best practices section, which is around engaging with the electric utility. And I think the title here really says it all. In our experience, and I think I speak for the whole team here, engaging with the electric utility early and often throughout the process is really important and sort of makes everything run more smoothly. If people wouldn't mind muting themselves in the background, that would be, thank you. So this is a area where we have a decent amount of discussion in the strategy, trying to really articulate why is this important? What are the types of considerations that utilities think about? How do you understand their timelines? And how do you work with them to make sure that the process flows smoothly on both sides of this? We've seen in various markets that this can be a real bottleneck. And so trying to avoid that to the extent that we're able to in Oregon is really important. And finally here, I think it's also worth noting for interested site hosts, developers, engaging with the utility is another really great way to find support for these projects, whether that's through financial support from incentives and rebates that many of the utilities in Oregon offer, both the investor-owned utilities and the publicly and cooperatively owned utilities, but also technical assistance and other programs that can really help to get these chargers out and deployed. On the right side here, you see just a brief schematic of some of the typical information that utilities find most useful to work with potential site hosts and developers, such as site plans, electrical diagrams, expectations for new electric load. So all of these pieces are, again, gone into in further detail within the strategy, but these are the types of best practices that we're trying to promote and to ensure that interested potential EV charging hosts and developers have a good sense of, so that they can be at least thinking about these things and asking the right questions at different points in the process. I will pause there and transition now. I believe next slide I'm handing it over to my colleague Aradhna, if I recall correctly, who's going to tell us about some of the other interesting pieces in this strategy.
Thanks, Ben. For those who've not met me before, I'm Aradhna Kelot, an associate at RMI on the same team as Ben. And I'll be starting here by talking through an important planning consideration chapter we've included, which describes cost estimates and the kinds of costs that you can expect to incur when installing charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. So the first part of this section is looking at what these costs are and understanding specific components. So the first cost, of course, is the cost of the charging equipment itself. This includes the cost of the charging pedestal and its related accessories, for example, wires, charging plugs, and others. This can further include contract costs, which provide access to data and networking. The other important cost component that we want to talk through, and we provided some amount of detail on this, is installation costs. This can include labor costs for excavation at the site, mounting the pedestal itself, and laying conduits and electrical wiring. This further can also include contracting and project management costs. One section of these installation costs can be grid upgrades. We recognize that this is not a cost that is always part of the overall project, but in specific situations, for example, at high-power DC fast charging sites, there may be a requirement to upgrade the transformer. And so we've also provided some detail on what these electrical system upgrade costs could look like. Next slide, please. Once we give you an overview of what these specific cost components are, we've also gone ahead and created cost ranges and estimated what the specific costs of installation and equipment look like for different charging power levels. These cost ranges were created with information collected from recent literature going back to about 2019. Some of this was conducted by our own team at RMI. Some of it is collected from the International Council of Clean Transportation, ICCT, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory at NREL. We recognize that most of the numbers in these studies are from 2020 or 2019. And so we included the effect of inflation to convert these dollars from 2019 to 2022 numbers. The other factor to take into account here is that a lot has happened since 2019, specifically in the North America and global economic markets. And so we sought input from industry experts in Oregon as to what the actual cost of this equipment and installation looks like on the ground. These experts ranged from EV service providers and utilities, and their anecdotal evidence was also included within these cost ranges. You'll see here that this is a glimpse of the total cost ranges for EV charging infrastructure of various power levels. These ranges also include the effect of siting considerations and the power levels of the specific types of chargers. We've included quite a bit of detail on what impacts these ranges and what can cause an increase or a decrease in costs within the chapter. One other thing to point out here is that these are fairly wide ranges, and we recognize that. And the midpoint of these ranges, does not necessarily depict what the typical cost looks like. And from anecdotal evidence, we've mostly observed that typical costs lie in the latter half of these ranges. Next slide, please. The next section of this guidance document that I'd like to talk through is the planning and deployment approach. Next slide, please. This deployment strategy in itself is designed to be a one-stop shop for local planners, including information and guidance, resources, and planning tools to support EV charging infrastructure planning in Oregon. I'll talk through two of these planning support tools that we are expecting to offer soon. Next slide, please. The first of these is the TEINA dashboard. Some of you may be familiar with this as we demoed this earlier in the year. The TEINA electric vehicle and charging infrastructure dashboard is a user interface model that allows a planner to select a geography, either at the county or census tract level, and view TEINA outputs for charging infrastructure related to that specific geography. These outputs are in the form of workplace L2, public L2, and DC fast charging infrastructure port numbers, and are given for the four major use cases as contained in TEINA, which is urban and rural light-duty vehicles, disadvantaged community adjustments, and transportation network companies. Next slide, please. The other tool that we are currently developing is the infrastructure planning tool. This is a GIS-based mapping application that is intended to help local planners identify EVSC locations that address equity, meet TEINA identified needs, and understand what siting priorities are important to them. This tool includes a location score by census tract and essentially gives the user an idea of how that specific census tract scores in terms of locating EV charging infrastructure based on the expected utilization, the gaps in that specific census tract in EV infrastructure, and how it affects equity. Aside from the score, there are some supplementary layers that will be present in this tool, as you can see in the list in this draft image here. This will include a number of data points that the user can compare to that score and see how, for example, current EV registrations compare to the score that is included here. This will also include certain filters that the user can turn on and off. For example, the user can ideally compare what the ODOT-defined disadvantaged communities look like when compared to the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation's disadvantaged communities. Thank you, Mary, for that note. Just noting that these two tools are not currently published, and we do expect that they'll be online sometime the next year in the first quarter. I'll now pass it over to Mary to talk through programs and funding. Next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. So this is a pretty rapid walkthrough of what we hope is sort of a one-stop shopping resource for everyone who's interested in trying to invest in charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. But all of this, of course, costs money. And in our resource, in our document, we are going to be including a chapter about supporting programs and funding that provide, it'll just be a snapshot in time, but provide a snapshot in time of the funding programs that can help accelerate EV charging infrastructure investment and or defray upfront costs or ongoing operating costs. And these programs will focus on the federal, the state, and utility levels in Oregon, with a particular call out for our Clean Fuels program that helps to provide additional incentives that can be used to defray ongoing operating costs for EV charging infrastructure. So next slide. Oops, you skipped. That's okay. Okay, so near-term priorities and shared responsibility. So up to now, we have been talking sort of nuts and bolts of, here's a bunch of good information for you to use to actually go out and try and plan and design and locate and invest in EV charging infrastructure. But we want to kind of take it back to a little bit of a higher level when we want to look at a transition to what we decided needed to be done in the TEINA study that we published about 1.5 years ago, when we looked at the scale and the type of charging infrastructure that was needed, the priorities for investment and funding, and where Oregon needs to go overall. Next slide. So we started with, I wanted to remind everyone of what our TEINA study implementation recommendations really focused on. And they really looked at equitable access to EV charging and the call for prioritizing investments in disadvantaged and rural communities and where there were charging gaps, especially by the public sector, to prioritize that there. Rural and urban charging infrastructure needs are also unique and compelling. Rural charging deserts are very prominent in Oregon, and we are recommending a focus on filling those charging deserts, filling those gaps, as well as identifying key tourist destinations where we can have stop and shop charging, and working towards lowering the problems that are caused for EV charging infrastructure when there is lower utilization in public charging. In urban areas, the big challenge is multifamily housing. How do you make sure that people who live in multifamily housing have opportunities to charge that's convenient and affordable? So some of the recommendations that we suggested there, we're looking at community charging at both level 2 and level 1 in everything from a church parking lot or a grocery parking lot to the multifamily housing itself. An emphasis on workplace charging, and also an encouragement to locate DC fast charging hubs that can serve multifamily housing, and also transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. Another area that we recommended that we focus on is corridors. And we definitely have the opportunity with the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program to start working on corridors at the kind of backbone level. But I will just remind everyone that in that program, we have funding. We hope we've got enough funding for 11 EV alternative fuel corridors, but there are many other corridors where we need to include DC fast charging that are not EV alternative fuel corridors listed right now. And importantly, both on the in all corridors, we're going to need to increase the frequency from or decrease the distance between charging from a backbone level of every 50 miles to 25 miles or even less. So we also are focused very much in our TEINA recommendations on increasing port redundancy, so to make sure that charging stations, the DC fast charging stations especially, have multiple opportunities for more than one type of EV to charge up at the same time. We also recommended in the light duty arena, these are just our light duty vehicle recommendations from TEINA, that we focus on trying to encourage and provide funding for private depot charging for fleets. And that, again, in those areas especially, that we try and encourage redundancy, resiliency, and the use of renewables, as well as wherever feasible, access to the community, if possible. So those were sort of just a reminder. That's kind of where we started a year and a half ago with where do we think we need to prioritize. And for the most part, we think these recommendations hold firm today. Next slide. The real near-term priorities continue to be focusing on multifamily housing, to promote workplace charging, and to develop electric vehicle charging stations to address current charging deserts, whether it's the gap in coverage, or to increase equity in both urban and rural settings. And again, with a call to action for the public sector to particularly focus on areas of investment that perhaps the private sector is less likely to invest in early on. The next slide. So in conclusion, what we'd like to do with this study is to remind everyone that the TEINA study to date has highlighted needs and recommended actions, but that to move forward to achieve ubiquitous EV charging infrastructure so that it's as easy and simple, as convenient and accessible as today's gasoline stations, it's going to require a great amount of collaboration. It's going to require public support and private investment. It's going to require the public sector and of all kinds, all levels, to streamline processes and to clear bottlenecks. Everything from state agencies, local planners, electric utilities, to EV service providers, automakers, site hosts, and that includes, the current gasoline stations. It includes convenience store operators and 7-Elevens of the world. There are increasingly diverse groups of private sector partners who are interested in providing EV charging infrastructure, but we all need to work together in order to make this a reality and do it in a timely fashion. So we really hope that this report, while providing a one-stop shop for a lot of resource information to plan and to move forward, really also helps to catalyze momentum for shared efforts. And ODOT will continue to play a role in trying to convene various stakeholders throughout the state to address key problems in trying to facilitate electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Amanda Peets, who will help guide our discussion.
Great, thanks, Mary. So I see that a lot of folks are writing some really great comments as we were going along here, which is fabulous because that really helps us to refine what we've created and make sure that we have the right components there. And that's really where we're pausing to ask you some questions now, generally on your initial reactions to this. What did you find really helpful? But also, are there important things that we missed in this that would be really helpful in supporting electrification and advising folks? And then any additional insights that you think would be really good to include here. So those are kind of those 3 core questions that are shown there. And I, like Suzanne, did not introduce myself before talking, but yes, I am Amanda Peets. I'm with the Oregon Department of Transportation. I'm our administrator for policy data and analysis. So climate office and all things electrification. Many of you I'm familiar with as we led the development of the TEINA study. And this is just, I think, some great spin-off work that the team's really been hard at work on. So look forward to a discussion here. And I see Phil, you have your hand up. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether this is germane to this conversation or not, but lately I've been paying attention to how you actually make these systems work once you've installed them. One of the ideas that I've heard in just lately is to require extended warranties on systems so that you increase reliability. Another is to consider the kind of unifying systems that you want to put in place. For example, the new high intensity charger for heavy vehicles, things like CHAdeMO and CSS and the NASC standard. Do we want to consider what kind of requirements ought to be in place for these kinds of things, or is that somebody else's job? Some of the utilities are already talking about requiring systems that allow them to regulate demand response. And the question of whether that ought to be at least set into place for level 2 charging, perhaps for DC fast charging as well. And then finally, some of the equity issues. I haven't heard anybody talk yet about shared electric vehicles that have their own level 2 plug-in at a spot where people can check them out, use them, or the place of better transit instead of electric vehicles for equity purposes. Anyway, those are some of the things I've heard from lately. I know that's firing at you through a fire hose, but I don't know how much of that belongs to in this group or in a different conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, so obviously Ms. Bernhardt is well-versed in transportation electrification and the key issues out there. So I think good things that were absolutely mentioned in terms of reliability. So if we're gonna build charging infrastructure out there, we put it out there and then the public tries it and it doesn't work, that's a fail. So we do need to have those reliability mechanisms. We also need to make sure accessibility to the system from the different types of chargers that you mentioned. So what I'll do is I'll call on Mary here in a moment to talk a little bit about our approach on the NEVI side and how I think that influences some broader conversations on how we can approach this. And then, yeah, there's many other issues around equity. Certainly, it's centered to how we're designing several programs at the Department of Transportation, even approaching our NEVI funding, and how do we call that out a little bit more clearly. We have that component in the TEINA study, the Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis, that broader piece, certainly core to that, but I think maybe part of your question is how is that coming through in this work and emphasizing that. So Mary, do you want to speak to any of those points that I mentioned and kind of how we might approach those?
Yeah, I would just say, Phil, you always have like multi-layered questions. It's really hard to stay on top of them all, but really good questions. So
I apologize. Too many.
No apologies needed. It's great. It's great stuff. So a couple of things so this is a resource document. Let's just kind of this is a resource document. In this resource document, we're trying to highlight all the different issues that should be considered and should be addressed. We are not necessarily trying to be prescriptive about exactly what we should be doing. But I think we will take that to heart, and maybe we can add something more that is a little bit prescriptive and talks about some encouragement. For example, on the NEVI program, right, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, that is the federally funded program to provide DC fast chargers every 50 miles on approved corridors. We are, for example, on the reliability issue, we have several plans to put in place in our requests for proposals when we work with the private sector that will incentivize higher reliability and perhaps either withhold funding or depending upon the data and analysis that we get in terms of feedback on reliability on the system, but more importantly, to also be very supportive of this effort and encourage maintenance, not only require maintenance plans, but provide funding to cover maintenance plans and continue that funding perhaps at a lower level, but beyond the 5 years of the NEVI program. So recognizing that reliability is critical and that we really need to have maintenance programs and plans in place. And I believe that we are considering having maintenance plans to be something that we require, as well as we do a community charging rebate program. I would have to defer to Jillian on that, but I think that would address a little bit of the reliability. And in terms of accessibility of charging ports, again, at the NEVI level, the minimum so far is the CCS standard, but there is approval, and we intend to exercise to some extent the opportunity to use some of that funding to include both a CHAdeMO and a Tesla port at some of the NEVI funded sites, because in recognition that older vehicles that have CHAdeMO are still going to need to travel, and that's one thing that we need to be cognizant of, and also the fact that about half the vehicles sold these days in Oregon are Teslas. And so we want to make sure that these charging stations are going to be accessible to all. We do have a discussion in here about charging ports, but again, it sounds to me like what you're asking for is, do we have a set of guidance recommendations? And we have some, but we'll take that into consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think all great questions, not only as ODOT endeavors in this space of electrification, but as all entities do. We need to be learning from one another, identifying best practices, and making sure that we have some kind of level of standardization, or at least preferred, that goes sometimes above and beyond some of those requirements. So thanks for all those questions, Phil. Really good points.
So you know what, I want to just address one other thing that Phil, that you raised. So to some extent, the TEINA study writ large covered all types, and from electric micromobility through medium and heavy duty trucks and school and transit buses, as well as long haul trucks. This particular ZEV charging infrastructure deployment strategy is just focused on light duty vehicles. And we can certainly make a nod to having shared EVs as a strategist, an equity strategy, but we were really pretty much focused on how do you help people who call up and say, I want to put in EV charging infrastructure. Where do I put it in? How do I start? How do I think about this? Where can I find information? So we were more focused on that than trying to be, I'd say, kind of normative or directive about how to solve all the problems.
Thanks, Mary. All right. I'm trying to kind of go between some of the chat, but also raised hands. I'll probably give a little bit of preference to raised hands. So if there's anyone that added something in the chat, you want to make sure that gets answered right now, I would suggest raising your hand. Otherwise, we'll try to kind of go back and forth between likely answer some things in chat. So next I have Ingrid Fish. Go ahead, Ingrid.
Hi, I just want to first start by thanking you so much for the work that you have done on the TEINA report. It's really helpful for local jurisdictions to have a baseline of this nature. And two things that kind of stuck out to me in terms of just questions about whether or not you guys are thinking about exploring these areas is one, multifamily installations for EV charging. There has been a big need for a toolkit for building owners to kind of understand all the steps needed, as well as costs associated with putting charging infrastructure into mostly existing buildings, but also new buildings. And I know Forth was working on said toolkit. I don't know where that is, but I am interested to know whether or not you guys are also exploring that, and because I think it's something that could be useful and shared widely across the state. And then secondly, I'm really interested in the charging infrastructure forecasts for, like forecasting how many charging stations we need in different areas over time. So I'm excited to kind of look to see whether, look to see the breakout for local jurisdictions. But one discrepancy between kind of like at least City of Portland and the state is that we are really aiming for net zero goals. So reaching our net zero climate goal. And I know your forecast for charging stations is really focused on the goal for EVs that you guys have set for the state at the state level. And so I'm just wondering whether or not you guys have thought about kind of the discrepancy between those goals and net zero goals of some of the cities. And then I added to the chat another question about, if you guys are thinking about like what we can do to get to a place where there's universal chargers so that every car can be charged by every charger. I mean, in terms of waste reduction and technology, it just seems like it would be so much more user friendly to like be moving in that direction. I know there's different manufacturers and industry barriers to going in that direction, but I'm also interested in that conversation.
Great. Well, Ingrid, likewise, very intelligent on issues of transportation electrification and asked some really great questions. I'll try to see if we can keep track of the many questions that were brought up here. So I think one is kind of around the lines of, I didn't write them down, so I'm just doing this off my head. One is along the lines of guidance materials that we have out there to support folks in electrifying, particularly around kind of housing and households. I will say some of that may come out of what's known as the climate-friendly equitable communities work. That is a rulemaking that Department of Land Conservation and Development did. ODOT is a partner in helping to implement that, and there are some requirements there around electrification and kind of minimum parking requirements within developments. And so I think that part of the guidance materials will touch on that a little bit more on how to do that. Otherwise, we are trying to kind of take inventory of what are the needs out there of kind of frequently asked questions that come up, and how can we help to serve those. So we'll be kind of keeping an inventory list of those things to see how we can help explain that a little bit more. Along the lines of kind of information out of the tool that we have, I think we're pretty excited to see what folks think of the modeling results in that tool that's available to show kind of what the needs are and the volumes. So look forward to hearing feedback from folks on that. I know a few jurisdictions have tried it out and gotten some good utility out of that. So certainly continue that feedback loop. I know that's like 2 of 4 questions. So Mary, other thoughts that you have on some of the key pieces that Ingrid brought up?
Yeah. Thank you again, Ingrid. Lots of great questions. So I'm going to deal with the dashboard, the TEINA dashboard, which is the modeling tool that then can get married with the mapping tool that I believe we're calling the infrastructure siting tool, but it's also designed really to have help with equity placement. You know, I want to just be real clear. We did not go back in and create different jurisdictions in this report. We've created a tool where you can go in yourself and identify, if you have a list of all the census tracts in the city of Portland, you can create a model by year that shows you for the TEINA goals what the number and type of EV chargers are for the city of Portland. You can also identify if you think that EV adoption is going to occur slower or faster. You can change the EV adoption levels and then learn what the different types of chargers are that are going to be needed. I see that Ben has got his hand raised. Ben, do you want to address this particular issue for a minute?
Yeah, I think I can speak to a couple of the questions briefly, if you don't mind. So good questions. Thank you, Ingrid. Just to carry on from what Mary was saying there with the tool, yes, for a particular jurisdiction, Oregon, you can go in and see, A, what does TEINA say about the need for EV charging of different types in that community? But then B, you can also, as Mary was describing, look at different levels of adoption and what the implications would be. So in your case, it sounds like for Portland, if you wanted to look at more rapid vehicle electrification, what are the implications and how does that differ from, again, in this case, go above what TEINA might say about the need in that area? I will note, and Mary kind of alluded to this as well, this is very much treating TEINA results as the baseline and looking at sort of modifications therein, rather than being a really granular model where users can go in and change, 45 inputs. But with that said, we have intentionally designed it to be flexible to allow you to explore, different rates of EV adoption and several other key inputs. The other piece I wanted to mention to your first question around the multifamily housing, within this report that we're going to be releasing next year in Q1, there is, as part of this best practices discussion, some focused guidance around what site hosts and building owners interested in providing charging at multifamily housing units and developments should think about, sort of more focused than just the general best practices. So we do have a decent amount of content on that and sort of key questions to be asking and other places to look for resources. With that said, I probably wouldn't call that a full toolkit as you had put it, but I do think we have some useful information that can start to really address this key market segment.
Great. Thanks, Ben, for those additions. Those are really helpful. So Ingrid, I remember your other question is in the chat too, which is around kind of the universal charging and making sure that every car, every time can charge. And I think, sometimes there's the proprietary chargers that are out there when their companies are investing their own money, not necessarily a lot that we can do about this. But in some ways, the funding from the federal government for NEVI has incentivized once proprietary chargers to considering to be publicly accessible in a way that I think the more that we bring some public dollars to the table, it incentivizes that broad public network. And going forward in what we can do is try to make sure to have things as universal as we can. Mary, anything else you wanted to add there?
No, Ingrid, I think, everybody wishes there was just one standard. It's a challenge. It just is. And the same thing is rearing its ugly head in the medium and heavy duty space as well. So there are standards organizations. Most parties are parts of those standard organizations, and they're trying to get to one standard. Many the Nissan is, which makes the CHAdeMO, makes a Nissan Leaf, which uses the CHAdeMO charging standard. Its future vehicles are using CCS. And so hopefully over time, we will have a convergence on a fewer number, if not universal. But, it's not clear what Oregon per se can do, but we can certainly advocate for that in lots of different forums and try and ensure that when we put in charging, we are taking equity into consideration for those who might be driving older vehicles and might need different types of charging that may not be so future looking. If that helps.
Yep. Thanks, Mary. Okay, let's go down the list. Is it Andrea Pratt?
Yes, thank you so much. This is Andrea Pratt with Volvo Group North America. Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and also just hats off to Mary and, ODOT, DEQ. You guys are really doing a great job. From a national perspective, you're really doing some great innovative things in Oregon, and I always love to point to Oregon as a model for others to follow. I did have a question. It seems that kind of the early work here is really focused on light duty vehicles. So I'm curious kind of what the plan is for medium and heavy duty kind of charging in terms of planning and funding. As you guys know, Oregon adopted the Advanced Clean Truck rule, which requires OEMs to sell an increasing percentage of zero emission vehicles in Oregon, starting with model year 2024. So that is right around the corner. And there are, tens of thousands of trucks in Oregon that will need to be charged. And so I'm curious, it seems like not including medium and heavy duty at this stage might need to be reevaluated. And then also just one comment on the equity front for medium and heavy duty. A lot of these fleets are small businesses. They only have a couple trucks, and a lot of them do not own their own land to install charging infrastructure. So it really underscores the importance of public charging for medium and heavy duty, especially in these early years as we're making the transition. So just curious if you could talk a little bit about, plans and how medium and heavy duty will factor into this work going forward. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll start this out and then other folks can correct me here, but had the opportunity recently to join a conversation that Governor Brown hosted among other Western state governors, really around this very issue, just recognizing the need for the medium and heavy duty sector in particular for the charging infrastructure. So we've had a lot of discussion with manufacturers, with our partners at the Department of Environmental Quality and others because of that clean trucks rule. And really one of the number one challenges out there is getting the infrastructure in place. And that we know from the TEINA study previously that we want to have about a 5-year lead time before some of those requirements take hold to try to get some of that infrastructure out there. So in a way, we're behind a little bit. So a couple things that we're doing that I'll say are more opportunistic are with the NEVI program. We're looking for a few potential sites where we have enough land space to create some pull-through design with the site design so that medium and heavy duty vehicles can be accommodated there, as well as some higher powered charging. So I think Mary talked about up to 350 kilowatts for at least one station. Could be a little bit lower than that, but higher powered is what we're going for there. Doing some future proofing of the wiring so that we can accommodate some of the larger vehicles longer term as those things come on. And then I think our biggest strategy for this is there's a fair amount of discretionary money, $2.5 billion from the federal IIJA funding. And we'll be looking at putting forward and partnering with folks to put forward some applications really for that medium and heavy duty charging infrastructure. I think in particular, likely along Interstate 5 would be one of the areas we'll focus initially, some of our highest use freight corridors. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about right now, but a lot more to be done on that medium and heavy duty side. Mary, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. Andrea, thank you for joining. This study was conceived as a light duty follow-on, which was not to slight a medium and heavy duty, but just that there was a huge amount of need and interest in trying to address questions there. But I would just like to say that we are very much as a state aware of and focused on the need for public and private depot charging for medium and heavy duty vehicles, ZEVs, whether they're school buses or transit buses, or whether they're delivery vehicles or long haul trucking. And the Department of Environmental Quality and the Oregon Department of Transportation just completed a study of incentives needed to address medium and heavy duty vehicle and infrastructure investments and transitionings to the the EV future of the world, that we submitted December 1st to the legislature, with the hope that we can create additional incentive programs. There is an incentive program that was created in the last legislative session that the Department of Environmental Quality is administering right now. It's a medium and heavy duty grant opportunity. The first round goes through January 15th. And you might want to look into submitting some proposals to suggest charging infrastructure. But we're aware of the needs, and really one of the striking things that in the studies that we've done and DEQ has done about Oregon is that over 80% of the vehicles, the medium and heavy duty vehicles in Oregon are like class 2B or class 3. So that really means like the smaller end of things, the pickup trucks. And so those are the ones that really can expect to utilize and leverage some of the NEVI funded, some of the new charging, fast charging stations that we're putting in. And we are explicitly going to be encouraging, as Amanda said, pull through designs and other designs to try and enable those vehicles to utilize some of the new infrastructure, federally funded infrastructure. The other thing I was just going to say is we really hope by early next year that the Section 11401 charging and fueling infrastructure grants that Amanda referred to, the $2.5 billion, half is for corridor, half is for community. And we're hoping that the guidance is going to be out for that, and that we can start, it's discretionary, it's competitive, but that we can start moving forward with that. But we are, working with our partners at the Department of Energy and also the Department of Environmental Quality, very much in trying to ensure that we've got medium and heavy duty opportunities and funding to help support both vehicle and infrastructure transition. And we'll be doing future work on that. It's not all yet, it has yet to be defined, but it's on the radar screen.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. A lot there we could get into as well. Zach, Lincoln.
Yes, thank you. Echoing Andrea, just immense kudos to the ODOT and the consultant team for getting us here today. Like, Oregon is really kind of leading the way with this kind of planning ahead of the curve, and it's great to see. My question is if on the EV infrastructure planner, if any steps are going to be taken to incorporate grid capacity as a means of planning for future charging infrastructure, and kind of as a related part of that, is any steps going to be taken to align or with timelines? So if we know, for instance, there's infrastructure or there's a capacity headroom, we can assume that the timeline will be shorter versus if major infrastructure upgrades will be needed.
Yeah, so sorry, my phone cut out a little bit at the beginning of that. So the capacity piece is from the energy side, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly. Is that going to be incorporated in the tool?
Yeah, so Ben or Mary, do you want to speak to the tool specifically, and then we can speak a little bit more broadly to kind of that interplay and how we think about sequencing?
Yeah, just to clarify, Zach, the tool you're talking about, the mapping tool or the TEINA dashboard? I believe the former.
The GIS mapping tool.
Yeah. So I think that the short answer is that we don't have sufficiently granular data across all the utility service territories to have something that, essentially a hosting capacity map across the whole state. And I should say, I'm going to defer to some of my colleagues who are a little closer into this, but I think the short answer is that we don't have exactly what you are envisioning, despite that being certainly a useful potential feature to have. We've been exploring some essentially electric power sector mapping layers that could be informative, but I don't think we have anything that's sort of as indicative for planning purposes that would be able to directly reflect anticipated interconnection timelines based on hosting capacity across the different service territories. Let me stop there and just, it seems like Mary probably wants to chime in, and then we also have some of our colleagues on the line who are more closely doing that mapping work, who can correct anything that I may have misstated.
Yeah, well, I have to defer to them too. I am not the expert on that, but I just want to address, Zach, that as part of the developing Oregon's National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure State Plan, we did reach out to all the utilities in the state, and we shared with them where those major corridors were likely to be, and we asked if they could help us try and identify areas where there might be excess capacity, where we could try and minimize costs and more easily put in EV charging infrastructure. And the short answer that we got from all of them was, we can tell you where it is today, but there is no guarantee that when you get to the point in time when you want to develop EV charging infrastructure at this specific location, that excess capacity will still be available. And so it seems like it is not a very easy to nail down attribute that has any longevity to it. And I don't know, I checked with Jillian, indicated we haven't gotten this kind of information from the utilities. Perhaps we've gone out and asked again, but anybody want to jump in, either Jillian or Radna?
No additional comments, but I think that's right. I think what we're trying to make sure here is we just have the level of data that a planner would need to carry out these decisions. What I may also add there is we will be able to give you the capability to download the shapefiles and carry out the analysis yourselves if you do possess that information.
Maybe
Awesome. Thank you.
A couple things to mention too is when I think we're actually, so for the NEVI sites, for example, we identify a corridor, we'll identify specific sites, working really close partnership with utilities. And I think the sequencing of sites will depend on many of the factors that you just mentioned in terms of grid capacity, availability, supply chain issues. So in terms of breaking ground and those kind of things, I think you're spot on that those things will influence pieces. And if anyone hasn't looked in the chat, Jessica Reichers, our partner at Department of Energy, mentioned that they are updating the BIZA, Biennial Zero Emission Vehicle report, that will get into some of the very issues that you're mentioning there. Jessica, is there anything else you want to say about that report or broadly to the question?
Great. Yeah, we are really focused this time on this report. If you haven't taken a look at it, I'll throw a link in the first one. I'll throw a link in the chat, but very focused on medium and heavy duty this go round. So we're looking for people who'd like to chat with us about what questions they'd like us to try and answer, or in general, if you've got some information around medium and heavy duty charging, problems you're seeing, barriers, opportunities, we're happy to listen to all of that. Or if you just want to give us some input on what to put in our report, reach out to me. Happy to talk to you. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Appreciate you adding there. All right, Larry. Wait now. Wait a minute. Larry, if you're speaking, we can't hear
There we go. How's that? Thank you.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is regard how the tourism industry of Oregon will be supported by the charging network, recognizing that a lot of people in the state travel to fairly remote locations for their recreation. What provisions are there for addressing range anxiety for those people wanting to get out more into the rural areas?
Yeah, so one of the things I'll mention, we've had a great partnership with Travel Oregon over the years. and identified opportunities to charge in some more rural areas. And they've partnered with the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department and installed some charging infrastructure in some of the major recreation sites there. Also in the identification of what we call scenic byways, which are really our tourist routes across the state, kind of our beautiful and to be celebrated visual areas in the state. We do have one or maybe two that are kind of fully electrified. They have that charging infrastructure along the route and also public transit infrastructure around the route. So those are a couple that are kind of out there in the works now. Mary, any additions you want to say kind of looking forward?
Just simply that we also are, our Oregon Department of Parks and Recreation, if I've got the acronym correct, is actively working on some pilots to put in charging infrastructure in some of the state parks as well, with the support of Rivian, which has been great. So there are, we are in active conversations and collaboration with not only Travel Oregon, but Jillian D'Amedio on our team has been out talking at various tourism conferences to understand the concerns. And we will be having a, we call it a community EV charging rebate program out by the middle of next year. Those are for level 2 chargers, for chargers that are more appropriate, where you have a longer dwell time, or you're out shopping, or you're off hiking, or you're something, you know, so you're there for a while. The level 2 chargers, and they will be those rebates, those as part of the community EV charging rebate program, will be available to tourism destinations, stop and shop destinations, as well as multifamily housing. And we are prioritizing areas that are rural, or I believe low income is the other term right now that we're using. So there is an effort underway to have several iterations of these rebates being offered. The first is scheduled for probably about June of 2023.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks for the question, Larry. All right, Thomas Ashley.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks. So I did want to just reinforce kind of the conversation, and appreciated it on medium and heavy duty. I realize that's been a bit out of scope to date with the report in this group. But yeah, just my organization is definitely increasing focus in this area. And I think the more that we all can collectively and work to layer in or otherwise replicate, you know, what this has been in the light duty context for medium and heavy duty, will be very valuable. And to one of the other messages, I think it will also be an opportunity for Oregon to be a bit ahead of other jurisdictions in that regard, which has a lot of value. Otherwise, I really just want to react to some of what I heard as the overview earlier. So really like the discussion around enabling visibility of funding resources, particularly at the federal level. So definitely wanted just to react that the kind of coordination discussion I heard, really valuable, and would just emphasize the importance of that. And then also want to acknowledge that there really are a lot of federal funding programs, and some of them are not very clear cut as it regards either eligibility or applicability to transportation electrification. And so in that regard, just want to, I guess, offer a little bit of a note of caution, depending on sort of the strategy for identifying or linking to some of those resources as this goes live in the next year. So happy to share some additional thoughts on that if helpful.
Yeah, Tom, that would be great. We would really appreciate, you know, all input, and, you know, that we could utilize. Or, you know, one of the questions that Amanda was asking is, you know, do you have more insights that you can share with us that would help improve this. And if you've got some suggestions on how to navigate some of the federal funding, that would be great, or any other issues. I just want to call out that I did attend BP Pulse's Omega charging station demonstration webinar earlier this week, and that had dealing with a lot of the fleet charging issues as well. And that just goes to the point that there are increasingly a larger and larger number of parties who are doing really good work in getting involved in EV charging, and for medium and heavy duty fleets as well as for light duty. And it really is important for us to all work together and share as much information as we can with one another and leverage the efforts. So thank you and your firm. Ben, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, just briefly, I really appreciate that perspective, Thomas, and not as part of this project that we have been working on with ODOT and Kittleson, but separately, some colleagues of ours at RMI have been thinking about exactly this issue of when there are federal programs available, they're not often straightforward to understand, to apply for. And so they have put together a tool, which I will link to in the chat here in case it's of use to any of the participants, that's focused. This is not specific to transportation, it's sort of economy-wide across different sectors, but may be useful for understanding what programs are available and providing some basic guidance around what is entailed within that program, applying for it, and so forth. So just a shameless plug for what seems like a useful resource for some.
To add to the shameless plugs, but not mine, but for today I read from the climate portal that I believe Atlas Public Policy puts out, and it had some very good information linking to resources that the federal government is either funding or has available right now. Some of it's the Internal Revenue, the Treasury Department's coming up with guidance for the EV charging incentives. Some of it is also that apparently the National League of Cities and another group are planning on having boot camps for smaller and medium-sized cities to try and access a variety of federal grant opportunities, and these are expected to start in January. So there are other resources that are being funded at the federal level to also try and make some of this opaque grant funding opportunities a little bit more clear.
That's great. Yeah, lots of resources, lots of great information out there. Other thoughts, perspectives, things that we need to consider, or other things you'd like to share? So there's some contact information in the chat. I think most of you probably have Mary Braslow's contact information too, but I would welcome any follow-up thoughts be shared. Just send an email, contact the team. I'm happy to take those after today and into the future, and look forward to continued opportunities to partner with many of you and help advance transportation electrification together and collectively. So with that, Mary, am I turning it back to you?
Yeah, I think the thanks is the watchword of the day. It's the season to be grateful, and it has been a real pleasure to work with you all. At this point in time, we don't have a follow-on TEINA meeting scheduled. We are going to take any and all information that you all share with us. Anything more that you want to follow up with us, if you have better diagrams that explain something, or other ways that you, utilities or other partners, communicate information, anything that might make this even a better product and more useful product, we would welcome that, and of course attribute it to whomever. But I just want to thank everyone for being part of this journey. It's been almost not quite 2 years, but certainly over a year and a half almost, working on TEINA projects. And we really appreciate that. And I'm being flagged right now to remind myself that there is still an opportunity for public comment that we haven't addressed yet. So if public comments, do we have, Matt, do you want to handle that part? I don't know if Matt's here or not. I think we've sort of been having public comment, but Suzanne, would you like to handle this part?
Sure. Since I did the wind-up MC role, I'll step in here. And to be honest, I don't know what the technical steps are here. I think everyone can unmute themselves, but if you want to raise hands in orderly fashion for folks outside the advisory committee who wanted to make a comment, that would be great. I'm not seeing any, so we'll give a few moments for people to get their thoughts together. Do one of you maybe want to work in the background and see if we need to unmute people? I don't want to close off public comment if there's something technical happening where people need to gain access to speak.
People should be able to raise their hand, and then we can help with the muting and unmuting.
Okay. Okay, great. We do have one then from a phone number here, 541.
Yeah, my name is Stuart Leibowitz. I'm calling from Roseburg, Oregon. And I just have a brief comment. I heard when you were going through the priorities that on rural areas, we have rural deserts, which is certainly an important priority. But when you hit the urban priority, you mentioned multifamily. And I just want to point out that we have many low-income apartment complexes here in Roseburg, and I don't want rural apartment complexes to be excluded or minimized in regards to a priority. So I would urge you to include all multifamily dwellings, both urban and rural, in your priority setting. Thank you.
Thank you. Great comments. That will especially be a focus of our community charging grant rebate program. So stay tuned for more guidance on that program. Others, go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to make an additional public comment.
So Suzanne, I see one hand raised, but is that this? Maybe it went down now.
Yes, we covered that one. Okay, I believe this is an advisory group member, but Philip Barnhart, go ahead. And
yeah, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you're good. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say I really like this format. I think this has been a very productive meeting and presentation. I've learned a lot, and I would urge you to continue using formats like this for these kinds of disseminating of information and for gathering comments.
Great, thank you. Always enjoy some accommodations for the team here. I think it's been a useful dialogue.
I also want to respond to thank you, Phil, but I also want to respond to someone who asked, will there be a notice that goes out when ODOT posts all this information on our TEINA webpage? And the answer to that is yes. We will have a government delivery notice that will go out that will let people know that we've posted this and that it's up there. If you have not already done so, and I think I posted earlier in response to some other comments, the link to the TEINA webpage. There is an opportunity on that TEINA webpage to sign up and be part of that listserv. Say you are interested in receiving more follow-up information. If you sign up on that, or if you have already signed up on our NEVI, on our National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure webpage, you will automatically get those Gov delivery list notifications for when material is posted on our webpage.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, I'm not seeing any additional hands raised. If the team saw any questions in the chat that they would like to additionally address, let's do that now, and then I'll pass it back to Mary in just a moment. And I think you've talked a little about next steps, but in case there's anything else to share out there, let's give a few more seconds. Any other public comments or anything additional to address from the team? Okay, great. Mary, I will hand it back to you to handle the slide.
So with that said, I think, you know, we're going to give you guys more than a half hour back, so you ought to be thrilled. And we thank you so much for your participation. We thank you for your participation, not just in this meeting, but all the meetings that have gone before. We really encourage you. You know, I know that someone from a tourism group said they'd be happy to talk about that. You know, make sure we have that information, whatever information you've got, so we can include that if there's an appropriate place for that. The electric micromobility study that we've been working on should be available and published early in January of 2023. And this document, which will include the tools, the TEINA dashboard, which is the numerical Excel spreadsheet tool, as well as the mapping tool that has the different equity layers and other layers, should be available by the end of the first quarter. Earlier, we're trying to get it out as soon as we can to be as helpful as we can. So thank you. And if you have any more questions or comments or concerns, please just feel free to get in touch with us. Do look on the web pages and sign up for further comments, and we'll keep you posted. Thanks so much. So I'm going to sign off now.
Thank you all for joining.
Thanks. Bye.